because Israel's position grows weaker by the day and Iran's grows stronger. Why? Because Iran's arsenal of missiles isn't quite inexhaustible, but pretty damn close. They're not going to run out of missiles. They're not going to run out of support. And they've got plenty of supplies and technical assistance pouring into the country from many, many different locations, not just in the Middle East, but also Russia, China, North Korea. There may be others that we don't know about. Iran's position grows stronger every day in the international arena. More and more countries are coming over to Iran's cause. Initially, it's psychological. Over time, it will become more material. Israel's position is the opposite. Israel is increasingly isolated, and it cannot withstand these onslaughts on its own. Remember, every time you fire a missile at a particular target that's incoming, in other words, we're talking about air defense missiles, it's habitual that you fire 2 or 3 missiles against every one missile that is aimed at you. Well, you're going to run out of missiles pretty quickly. And Israel's very small. It's smaller than the state of New Jersey. And Iran is the size of Western Europe. And there are more than 90 million people living in Iran. So while Israel can certainly make life miserable for Iran, it can do a lot of damage. And of course, it always has nuclear warheads. And if it decides that it needs to use a nuclear warhead in order to win its war, that's very dangerous, because at that point, I would be very surprised if nuclear warheads did not show up in Tehran.
All right, wow. Going to Iran's retaliation now. I was surprised. I think I was doing a live with, it was Scott Ritter at the time when Iran was hitting Israel back. And Scott said, they need at least a few waves for this to be a decisive retaliation. But they only had, I think, 3 or 4 waves, about 200 missiles. Did that, was that less than you expected? Was it more of a symbolic response, or do you think that was a pretty extensive response from Iran? And what do you expect Iran to do over the next few days?
I think the attacks will intensify. The numbers of missiles will increase. The damage that will be inflicted will be much worse. What we're witnessing is the aftermath of the initial disarming strikes that the Israelis launched. The Israelis did succeed in disrupting command and control. They succeeded, at least partially, disarming or disrupting the integrated air defenses. So to that extent, it was successful, at least for the first 24 hours. What has surprised the Israelis, and frankly has surprised me, is the rapidity with which the Iranians have recovered. And they continue to recover, and their power and their influence continues to increase. So I would expect far, far worse strikes in the future than anything we've seen to this point.
So you don't think Iran has been significantly weakened? Or you think they have been significantly weakened, but they can recover relatively quickly?
Well, I think they were weakened. What's this word significant? Let's get back to reality. Iran is a nation of 90 million. It's the size of Western Europe. It has thousands upon thousands of missiles. How do you weaken that? You can temporarily disrupt it. You can suppress it for a short time. But we've discovered pretty clearly that, short of the use of a nuclear weapon, and that's not an impossibility, that Iran is absolutely, I would argue, unbeatable.
You're the second person I've spoken to, Colonel, that mentions the Israeli nuclear weapon. But do you think it's even on the table? So Israel seems to have, to a different degree, the advantage right now in the war. They've got air superiority over Iran. Again, feel free to disagree. And they've gotten rid of a lot of these commanders, which are not replaceable. You said the same thing about Hezbollah last time as well, and they have been replaced. But when do you think Israel would even consider using a nuclear weapon in this war? And would the US be okay with this? Like, would they require America's authority before using a nuclear weapon?
Well, let's look at, there are 2 questions here. One is about Israel and the other is about the United States. The Israelis historically have always let it be known, either through the back door, so to say, through other powers, or by inference, that they have a nuclear weapon and that they're prepared to use it. One of the reasons, excuse me, in 1973, that the Egyptians, once they crossed the Suez Canal and established a defense on the far side, the eastern side of the Suez, and did not march further east, is because Sadat understood that the Israelis had a nuclear weapon. And he said, if we go for the Mitla Pass and we try to penetrate Sinai and move into Israel, we have to expect that the Israelis will use a nuclear weapon against us. The Egyptians, even now, that are sitting on the border with Israel, are very hesitant to take on the Israelis directly, not because they cannot do it militarily, they can, but because they have been threatened periodically over many years with the use of a nuclear weapon by Israel to destroy the Aswan Dam. Now, that would have catastrophic consequences for Egypt. I think people in the Middle East are tired of being bullied by the Israelis. And I think they're looking at Iran as standing up to the Israelis, even though they do not have, at this point in time, a nuclear weapon, and are determined to fight it out. Of course, they're large enough in terms of space and population that they can do that. But I think over time, we'll see everyone else in the region rally to them. So the bottom line is, would the Israelis use it? I think what you might see in the future is, as Israel weakens and is subject to more and more destructive impact from Iran, and as Iran's position in the international community grows stronger, that the Israelis may well tell us, if we can't survive and you're not going to help us, we'll use a nuclear weapon. That could happen. We would not want that to happen, clearly. But that's something they could threaten us with.
You think you could twist America's arm by threatening to use a nuclear weapon if the US does not get involved?
That could happen, especially as Israel's position weakens. Israel's in a terrible position right now. Israel can't easily replace its losses. And as I said, Israel is, by comparison with Iran, a postage stamp. I don't think Israel would be doing what it's doing right now if it wasn't reasonably confident that it has control of the White House and the Congress. They think they've got control of President Trump, that when he's presented with this fait accompli, Israel is in a fight for its life. This is an existential fight for Israel. You have to come and help us, that he will do so. Perhaps he will. I don't know. That's the assumption. Most people in the United States assume that's the case. And when I say people, I'm talking about people inside the Beltway in Washington. I don't know, because President Trump must surely understand that if we become directly involved, the temptation for many other states to do so is overwhelming, not the least of which are Russia and China, as well as other states and virtually all the Muslim states in the region. Now, why would this be? Because I think people look at what's happening and they say, well, if we don't come to the aid of this country and prevent it from being destroyed by the United States, then we'll be next on the menu. Remember, Russia has already been subjected to this. The same forces in New York City and in the London city banks, the people who wanted to get into Russia, destroy the state, rip it apart, rape its resources, partition it, turn it into a permanently weakened third world state, have failed. They didn't achieve their aims. The Russians have recovered. They're stronger than ever. They're not fools. They know that there are a lot of people in London, in the banking industry, in the financial industry, as well as in Washington and New York City, who very much want control of the oil fields in the Middle East. Remember that for Americans who are thinking strategically, if you want to dignify their thinking with that word, I don't say that, but in their minds, strategically, if you can get control of the oil and natural gas fields in the Middle East, if you can destroy Iran and bully everybody else into line, then you have in their minds China by the throat, because China is extremely dependent on the oil and gas that comes through the Persian Gulf. I mean, frankly, it's not that important to us anymore economically, but it is important to the world and specifically to China. The question is, if we go into this with the goal of destroying Iran and ultimately getting control of these oil and gas fields, how close do we come to a direct confrontation with Russia and China, North Korea, and any number of other states? We don't know, but it's a very dangerous position to take. You can only bully and humiliate people to a certain point, and then they stand up and fight back. So I'm very concerned that this thing could rapidly run out of control. You know, Clausewitz used to say, before you start a war, you'd better understand what kind of war you're really fighting. And I think the Israelis thought that they could bully Iran more easily, they could suppress it more easily, they could be successful in their efforts to disrupt and bludgeon Iran than they were. They miscalculated. Iran has recovered. It's growing stronger. This is going to get worse, not better. So that was a bad miscalculation. Now they're falling back, as perhaps they always intended to in any case, on the United States. The United States normally doesn't like to intervene in things unless we can dictate the outcome. We like to impose solutions. We can't do that. The Russians won't sign up for it. Neither will the Chinese. And by the way, I don't think most of the Europeans will. So I think this is a very dangerous time. And that's why I wrote in this X that I sent out a proposal for a great power peace conference. We need the United States to sit down with Russia, China, India, Brazil, these great powers, and help arbitrate the situation. We need to put a stop to what's happening in Gaza. If anybody thinks that this is in isolation from Gaza, they're wrong. The Israeli contempt for human life in Gaza, their readiness to murder and starve tens of thousands of human beings, even millions to death, is something that has profoundly affected the whole world except the United States, because most Americans know very little about it. The media really doesn't cover it very much. So I don't think there's an appreciation of the depth of hostility and the readiness to push back against us that exists today.
How likely, before I ask my next question, there's just been a report of an Israeli drone that struck police headquarters in Tehran. So we've got more drones here. That's the footage that just came in. We've got more reports here of Israeli drones being involved. Question I have for you is, how likely is it that Iran strikes US bases in the region before the US gets involved, maybe based on Israel's request? What's a higher risk? The US joins based on Israel's request, or Israel kind of twists Trump's arm into joining, or Iran forces the US to join by hitting their bases?
The Iranians will not deliberately attack any US positions in the region unless we directly intervene. Now, they know that we've given plenty of help and assistance to the Israelis. That's not really open to debate. But why would you want to give Washington an excuse to come in full force against you? That would be very stupid. And I think the Iranians are sensitive to that. They will stick to their current approach, which is to focus their attacks on Israel. They will keep an eye out and watch carefully on the things that we do, but they're not going to give us an excuse to go in.
What is Israel's goal with this, Colonel? Is it to just destroy Iran's nuclear capacity? Is it to just destroy Iran's military? Is it for a regime change that someone's talking about? We saw Netanyahu's speech, I think it was yesterday or the day before, that is urging Iranian people to rise up against the regime. What do you think is the goal of Israel? What is success for them when it comes to Iran?
The destruction of the Iranian state, the reduction of the country to poverty and despair. That leaves Israel as the hegemonic power of the region, with the United States backing it 100%. Those are the goals.
And would that be achieved by sustained military attacks until the military is completely deteriorated, or are they seeking, is that part of their strategy to seek a regime change?
No, it can't be accomplished without us, without the United States. That's the whole point. Israel has no chance whatsoever of reducing Iran to rubble unless it uses a nuclear weapon. And if it uses a nuclear weapon, it risks having nuclear weapons used against it. And those nuclear weapons can come from any number of nuclear armed states. I think the Israelis know that. And so they're going to refrain from that. Although, as I pointed out earlier, in any last bit attempt to drag us into this war on their behalf to achieve their aims with our military power, they may threaten to use a nuclear weapon. You know, that's a nightmare. That's the last thing in the world that we in the United States want, or for that matter, anywhere else on the planet. But it's something that the Israelis will do if they, or threaten to do if we don't do as they wish. But remember this, there are also powerful forces inside the United States. I pointed to them, financial forces in New York City, as well as in the City of London banks, wealthy powers that want access and control of those oil and gas fields. Iran is the only state right now that presents real resistance to the dominance of New York City and London over the oil and gas fields. Now, the United States Armed Forces are viewed by New York and London,